While there are certainly exceptions, as we'll get into shortly, according to the majority of first-hand accounts from people who've actually been shot, having a hunk of searing hot metal traveling around Mach 1 tear through any part of your body doesn't actually hurt that much. At first. For example, consider this account from one Deborah Cotton who was struck by a bullet during a Mother's Day parade in 2013. When the bullet hit me, surprisingly, it didn't hurt at all. Not one bit, which shocked me. I remember thinking, that felt like someone just chucked a small pebble at me. In Deborah's case, the bullet hit her in the side around her hip and traveled up, finally stopping around her ribcage on her left side. She went on to have 36 surgeries, losing a colon, gallbladder, one kidney, part of her pancreas, 2/3 of her stomach, and the duodenum. Turns out that the initial bit of small intestine directly connected to the stomach. The more you know. Interestingly, despite the severe damage to her body, which nearly cost her life later at the hospital, she states, "After about 90 seconds passed, I realized, I may not be dying after all. I wonder if, God forbid, am I paralyzed?" I wiggled my toes, then my ankles. It was all good. So I wasn't dying, and I wasn't paralyzed. There still was no sharp or shooting pain, nothing like what you think you'll feel when a metal object rips through your body, but I was later told that the 9mm used in the shooting accounted for the lack of initial pain. The bullets were the kinds that stay intact rather than the kinds that explode into flesh-tearing shrapnel. If you suspect that Deborah Cotton might just be a bit of a badass to shrug off having her insides eviscerated, consider this account from one Ryan Jarsey, a guy who was attempting to dial 911 to report that he'd been robbed, only to have his shotgun slip from his hand as he was dialing the number. When he reflexively went to grab it, he accidentally pulled the trigger, shooting himself in the leg, more or less making it look like, to quote him, a pile of Alpo dog food smushed up against what used to be just below my knee. He goes on, "My brain didn't actually register what had happened until a few seconds later. My shin bone was sticking out about 2 or 3 inches from the ragged end of my stump, but I felt nothing, nor did I notice it. I attempted to stand, and then I felt it. I yelped in pain, fell flat on my face, and made the foolish decision to try standing up once more. The entire weight of my body was now on that bone, and that bone, weakened by 96 tiny lead pellets traveling at twice the speed of sound, didn't hold up very long. It snapped like a piece of blood-soaked chalk, jamming the shards into my newly opened calf muscle and feeling, let's go with uncomfortable." Incidentally, to add insult to life-threatening injury, Mr. Jarsey notes that all of this occurred a mere 12 hours after he had been removed from his parents' health insurance coverage, and he had not yet gotten any of his own, with the whole thing, including amputation of his leg, costing him a little over $60,000. So for many, there's little pain at first, but what about other sensations? While various people report everything from a bee sting sensation to getting hit with a baseball bat, minus the pain, one nearly universal report is of extreme and persistent burning in the initial aftermath. As Redditor Tia Jambon states, "I'm not one of those I didn't even realize I was shot people, though I can definitely understand where they're coming from. The very first thing I felt can only be described as a sudden impact of no sensation. I felt numbness wash over the area. If I had not realized I was about to be shot shortly before I was, I could see how I could have easily been too distracted to notice this immediate response. That feeling then gave way to a horrible burning sensation. It's a very hot pain. It feels the way a very flushed face or a blister feels, but intense and painful." Going back to Deborah Cotton, she corroborated this, saying, "As I continued to take inventory of my body and soul, that burning sensation in my stomach where the bullet traveled began to take over my focus." Yet another account relates, "It's a bit of a burning sensation, mainly. Best way I can describe it is that it feels like being continuously poked, as if someone is holding multiple sharp pricks to you and pushing in, but not stabbing." From there, similarities in accounts of what it's like to be shot vary much more significantly depending on the location of the injury. For some, pain comes quite quickly after the initial shock wears off, sometimes extremely quickly. For example, in the case of a lawyer who got shot in the knee, he reported almost no blood, but for me at least, the "it doesn't hurt because of the shock" part lasted about 2 seconds, then immense pain that I can't even begin to compare to anything else. By the time I got some morphine, I was drenched in sweat and writhing uncontrollably from the pain, and I normally have a high pain tolerance. Others simply report waves of general achiness growing to an extreme level, while in a minority of cases, some don't note much of any real pain after. As one man shot in the calf by a .22 notes, honestly, it didn't hurt that bad. Hopefully, being shot by a smaller caliber has helped me build up my immunity towards larger bullets. One side note here is what getting shot in the head feels like. It turns out that plenty of people actually survive this type of wound, with those who are quite cognizant of the incident universally reporting extreme headache-like symptoms. For example, one Michael Moland actually didn't even know he'd been shot. Turns out his wife had accidentally shot him in the head while he slept. The result was simply him waking up and noting that he had a severe headache and asking his wife April to drive him to the hospital, which she did. It was only after a nurse looked him over that she informed him that he'd been shot in the head, at which point April bolted. What's more interesting than the headache symptoms, though, is something universally reported in the handful of accounts of headshot survivors we reviewed. They all report an accompanying ringing, as Gary Malias, who was shot in the head and also likewise didn't realize what had happened until he was at the hospital, stated, "There was a ringing inside of my head. It was a noise that I'll never forget. Never heard it before and never heard it since. It was like being in a can, I guess. Just so loud." Joe Podge further states of his experience getting shot in the head, "There is this very loud buzzing, almost a sort of ringing type sound as to when it happens. Surprisingly, it is very loud, like two bees inside of your ears, but sounds more like how your ears would normally ring, just uncomfortably loud. The initial ping, as I call it, can be heard before the ringing commences, like someone hitting metal on metal, but it's high-pitched. After that, very loud and scary ringing commences, but no pain is registered at that moment." As for the long-term aftermath of getting shot in general, this varies considerably, again based on the extent and location of the damage, though victims often reported the recovery and rehab is worse than the initial pain of getting shot. Going back to the case of the aforementioned lawyer shot in the knee, he states, "What the movies seem to miss most, though, is the long-term recovery. It was months of continuous pain afterward. Oxy barely took the edge off." More than potential long-term chronic pain and the like, perhaps unsurprisingly for people who endured such physical trauma and in many cases near loss of life, the psychological side of being shot is also occasionally noted as being something that makes the whole experience awful. As stated by Deborah Cotton, "The impact of the shooting on my mental health, though, showed up in surprising ways. I endured bouts of PTSD during the first months after the shooting. Once home, I began counseling sessions with 2 psychologists, both PTSD experts. For a while, I was terrified of being in a car going over 35 miles per hour, and I'm not exactly sure why, since driving doesn't seem to have anything in common with guns, but eventually the fear faded away." So there you have it. While specific accounts of what it's like to be shot vary wildly, in the general case, it would seem you can expect little in the way of initial pain or even much sense that you've just been mortally wounded, followed by an onset of extreme burning, followed by some measure of general pain, followed by chronic pain throughout recovery and maybe beyond, and potentially a little side of psychological trauma just for fun. That is, if you don't simply die in the first place. Good times. So look, getting shot isn't fun. We just learned that at length. As the general rule goes, you should never bring a knife to a gunfight, unless, of course, that knife happens to be the NRS-2, a knife that also just so happens to have a gun built into the handle. Designed in the early 1980s for Spetsnaz troops, the NRS-2 is still used today by some members of the Russian Special Forces. The origins of this peculiar firearm can be traced back to the 1970s, when engineers working at the Tula Arms factory were tasked with creating a close combat weapon for Army reconnaissance units. Under the oversight of designer Adi Kilinin, an early precursor to the NRS-2, known interestingly enough as the NRS, was developed that made use of the recently created SP3 ammunition. These are specialized, so-called silenced bullets that had been developed during the Cold War period, especially for spies and special forces units operating either covertly or behind enemy lines. Although noticeably weaker than regular ammunition, SP3 ammunition was considered to be acceptably powerful for single-shot weapons like the MSP Special Compact Pistol, which was also developed under the supervision of Kilinin. But the NRS wasn't just a knife with a gun in the handle, it also doubled as a screwdriver, a saw, and even had a tool built into the scabbard that could cut through wires up to 5mm thick. The scabbard was also insulated so that the knife could be used to cut through electrical cables as long as the line wasn't transmitting more than 380 volts. A few years later, when SP3 ammunition was phased out in favor of the more powerful and reliable SP4 ammunition, the NRS was redesigned. Along with providing greater killing range, the NRS-2 included a number of other noticeable improvements, such as an attachment for crimping primer caps and a sharper tip more suitable for stabbing through thick cloth and thinly armored targets. This new and improved gun knife officially went into service in 1986. So now you might be wondering, well, how exactly does the NRS-2 work? Well, to put it simply, housed just inside of the knife's handle is a small gap in which an incredibly rudimentary firing mechanism can be found. The mechanism can store one round at a time and needs to be removed once the round has been spent. The handle of the knife also features a safety switch to prevent accidental discharge and a set of iron sights to help with aiming. Speaking of which, since the gun part of the NRS-2 is housed inside of the handle, to aim and fire the NRS-2, you need to point the knife end toward your own face. While this looks unthinkably stupid, firing the NRS-2 in this fashion isn't considered overly dangerous because it has almost non-existent recoil. On top of this, the NRS-2 has virtually no muzzle flash, and the shot itself is relatively silent, making it an incredibly covert and deadly weapon in the right hands. In terms of range, while exact details are hard to come by since the NRS-2 is generally only used by Russian special forces and this information isn't widely available, it is said to be deadly from up to 25 meters away. In the event the user misses with his one shot, the NRS-2 is also specially weighted so that it can be used as a throwing knife. While the NRS-2 has the potential to be an incredibly deadly weapon in the right hands, it's noted that it's mostly treated as a curio by most of today's Spetsnaz troops who prefer to use the version without a gun hidden in the handle. This version, rather than having a gun hidden inside, has implements like matches, a compass, and other goodies that an enterprising soldier might need. Nevertheless, the NRS-2 continues to stand as a testament to man's ingenuity when it comes to coming up with new ways for killing one another. And now for a bonus fact. A common misconception about the NRS-2 is that the weapon actually shoots out the blade of the knife instead of a bullet. While ballistic knives are absolutely a thing that exist, they are generally inferior to the NRS-2 due to the fact that they're only accurate and perhaps more importantly deadly at a fraction of the range. While it is rumored that ballistic knives were at one point developed for the Spetsnaz, there's little proof that they ever used them outside of Tom Clancy novels and Call of Duty games. Not that they'd need them anyway, considering that an integral part of their training is learning how to use throwing knives. Indeed, the training is so in-depth that even the standard issue shovel issued to all Russian soldiers for digging trenches can be used as an impromptu throwing device in the hands of a trained soldier. Spetsnaz troops are so well trained at throwing objects with deadly, unerring accuracy that when putting on a show, you can see them hurling shovels, knives, and even hatchets at targets while performing such acrobatics as backflipping through the air. It's a scene which is played out in countless spy thrillers. An assassin slinks stealthily through the shadows, silently stalking his target. At the perfect moment, he pulls out his pistol, a long cylindrical silencer fitted to his muzzle. The target, completely unaware of his presence, the assassin raises his weapon, takes aim, and fires a single shot. But instead of a loud bang, the weapon only makes a dull thump, or a hiss, scarcely recognizable as a gunshot. The target drops dead, and as bystanders look about in confusion for the source of the fatal shot, the assassin melts back into the shadows and slips away. Silencers, or as they are more correctly called, suppressors, are one of Hollywood's favorite plot conveniences, allowing characters to carry firearms in situations where the need for stealth would otherwise preclude their use. But how do these seemingly magical devices actually work, and can they really render a firearm completely silent, or is it all just a bunch of Hollywood hokum? The noise produced by a firearm varies wildly depending on the type and ammunition, ranging from around 140 decibels for a .22 caliber rimfire rifle to 172 decibels for a .50 caliber machine gun. The US Occupational Health and Safety Authority, or OSHA, defines 140 decibels as the threshold for pain and immediate hearing loss, and 85 decibels as the threshold for hearing loss after prolonged exposure, meaning that using any firearm for an extended period without ear protection will result in permanent hearing loss. The sound of a gunshot gunshot comes from three different sources. The first being the movement of components within the firearm's mechanism or action, such as the hammer, firing pin, bolt, or slide. The second source of noise is the bullet breaking the sound barrier as it exits the barrel, creating a tiny sonic boom. This is also the source of the bullwhip's distinctive crack. But the most significant source of noise is the sudden expansion of hot propellant gas as it exits the barrel behind the bullet, and it is this effect which suppressors seek to mitigate. The first modern firearm suppressor was invented in 1902 by Hiram Percy Maxim, son of Sir Hiram Stevens Maxim, inventor of the first practical machine gun. Maxim, an avid hunter and target shooter, sought a means of indulging in his hobby without bothering his neighbors with noise. In 1908, he formed the Maxim Silent Firearms Company to produce suppressors for both military and civilian clients. The company flourished until 1934, when the National Firearms Act, or NFA, banned the private sale of suppressors in the United States. The Maxim suppressor was a relatively simple device consisting of a short tube fitted to the muzzle of a firearm containing a set of regularly spaced spiral metal baffles. Each baffle in turn featured a central hole forming a cylindrical channel down which the bullet could travel. According to a later Maxim Company brochure, the device worked as followed. The propellant gases are made to whirl around inside the silencer. This whirling forces the gas to fly out from the center by centrifugal force, leaving a central space. Just the same as when water is whirled around a set bowl, a hole or space forms at the center. This leaves the space for the bullet to make its passage. The gas cannot press through the space until it slows down. This causes it to discharge into the atmosphere gradually. This absolutely prevents noise and also reduces recoil over 2/3. Modern suppressors work more or less on the same principle, though nearly all have abandoned Maxim spiral baffles for straight ones, as the former are more expensive in manufacture and prone to overheating. By slowing down and cooling the propellant gases and allowing them to dissipate over a longer period of time, suppressors mitigate the sudden expansion responsible for much of a gunshot's noise. Many suppressors also incorporate a hollow expansion chamber at the rear, which allows the propellant gases to expand and decelerate before reaching the baffles, increasing their effectiveness. Efficiency can further be enhanced by filling the suppressor with water or grease, which serves to quickly cool down and reduce the pressure of the propellant gases. However, this liquid quickly evaporates and must be topped up after a certain number of shots. A similar technique is to pack the expansion chamber with metal mesh or other porous conductive material. Like the water or grease, this acts as a heat sink to cool down the propellant gases, but lasts significantly longer and requires less maintenance. While most suppressors use Maxim-style metal baffles, a few models use rubber versions known as wipes without pre-cut central holes. Instead, the bullet must first punch through the wipes, which then seal up behind it, trapping the propellant gases in the suppressor. Wipes also serve the secondary function of slowing down the bullet for reasons that we will soon cover. This system can make a suppressor extremely efficient, but its effectiveness degrades significantly after only a handful of shots as the wipes become increasingly worn out, requiring them to be frequently replaced. For this reason, wipe-based suppressors are largely relegated to firearms intended for infrequent use, such as special forces or pilots shot down behind enemy lines. Yet another principle employed by certain suppressors is destructive interference or noise cancellation. This involves the use of a hollow chamber at the end of the suppressor, precisely sized so that any residual sound waves exiting the barrels are reflected back in and cancel themselves out. This is the same mechanism used by ordinary automotive mufflers. Indeed, Hiram Percy Maxim invented the muffler concurrently with the silencer, with mufflers becoming the Maxim Company's main source of revenue after suppressors were banned in 1934. Newer, more advanced silencers make use of a technique called frequency shifting, whereby propellant gases are vented through specially sized holes to shift the frequency of the noise beyond the range of human hearing, similar to the principle in a dog whistle. But while advanced suppressors can eliminate much of the noise generated by the expansion of propellant gases, as previously mentioned, this is not the only source of noise in a firearm. Thus, a firearm fitted with the world's best suppressor will still generate significant noise in the form of the bullet's sonic boom and the cycling of the action. The latter problem is more easily managed in manually operated firearms like bolt-action rifles, as the shooter can wait until they have retreated out of enemy earshot before cycling the action. The Delisle carbine used by British commandos during World War II even featured rubber pads to muffle the sound of the bolt being opened and closed. Mechanical noise is harder to avoid in self-loading firearms, so in many cases such weapons are operated in single-shot mode only. For example, the Knights Armaments XM9, a suppressed M9 Beretta pistol issued to US Air Force crews for self-defense behind enemy lines, features a special lever to lock the slide closed, preventing it from cycling and producing noise when fired. This means the pistol must be manually
recocked after each shot, but given the dire circumstances under which the weapon is meant to be used, this is considered as an acceptable trade-off. The sonic boom produced by the bullet is comparatively easier to deal with. While certain cartridges, like 45 ACP, are naturally subsonic, most ammunition must be slowed down for use in suppressed firearms. This is accomplished in a variety of ways, the simplest being to reduce the propellant powder load in the cartridge itself. Another technique, as previously mentioned, is to fit the suppressor with solid rubber wipes. The friction generated by punching through these wipes slows down the bullet, such that by the time it emerges from the suppressor, it's traveling at subsonic speeds. However, in addition to quickly wearing out, wipes also significantly degrade the accuracy of the bullet, meaning wipe-based suppressors are no longer widely used. The third way of slowing down the bullet is to drill holes in the barrel to bleed off propellant gas, preventing the bullet from attaining supersonic velocity. This method has the advantage of allowing the use of regular supersonic ammunition without the loss of accuracy associated with wipe-based suppressors. However, all three of these techniques are only applicable to pistol-caliber cartridges like 9mm parabellums. Larger rifle cartridges are too powerful to be effectively slowed down by wipes or gas venting and become unstable and inaccurate at subsonic speeds. Thus, no matter how sophisticated a suppressor they are fitted with, most rifles will produce an unavoidably loud supersonic crack. Suppressors can either be detachable, screwing or latching onto the end of the barrel, or integrated into the firearm itself. For an integral suppressor to work, part of the barrel must be ported or drilled with holes to allow propellant gas to vent out, otherwise the gas would bypass the silencer entirely, rendering the whole device pointless. Integrally suppressed firearms tend to be quieter than those with detachable suppressors due to the greater care taken in integrating the firearm's ballistics with the suppressor's design. However, a well-designed detachable suppressor can be just as effective, and examples have been produced for nearly every type of firearm, even shotguns. So yes, that scene from No Country for Old Men, where Mexican hitman Anton Chigurh uses a suppressed shotgun, is technically accurate. But while silencers have been developed for machine guns and submachine guns, they are of relatively limited use in this role. This is because the rapid rate of fire does not give the propellant gas sufficient time to vent from the suppressor, causing a buildup of pressure that severely reduces sound suppression. Sustained automatic fire can also overheat and damage the baffles, quickly destroying the suppressor. For this reason, suppressed machine guns are typically fired in semi-automatic mode, or, at worst, in short bursts. One type of firearm that cannot be easily suppressed, despite Hollywood's frequent claims, is the revolver. This is because the vast majority of revolvers feature a large gap between the front of the cylinder and the rest of the barrel. Much of the sound produced by a revolver comes from propellant gas leaking through this cylinder gap, which a suppressor cannot mitigate. There is, however, one major exception to this rule. The Russian M1895 Nagin revolver features a mechanism that pushes the cylinder forward against the rear of the barrel just before the hammer drops and fires an unusual 7.62 by 38mm cartridge whose bullet is seated deep in the brass case. This allows a tight seal to form between the cylinder and the barrel, preventing gas from leaking out and allowing the Nagant to be suppressed. Indeed, for several decades, suppressed Nagant revolvers were used by Soviet NKVD secret police and later Vietnamese Viet Cong guerrillas to carry out covert assassinations. But Simon, you're probably thinking right now, all of this so very interesting, but do silencers actually make firearms silent? Alas, once again, Hollywood has been lying to you, for in real life, no suppressor is capable of completely silencing the sound of a gunshot. For example, even the best commercial suppressors can only reduce the noise of a .22 caliber rifle from 140 to 111 decibels, a 9mm handgun from 162 to 126 decibels, and a .556 caliber AR-15 rifle from 165 decibels to 132. This is, as you may have noticed, still extremely loud, a far cry from the barely audible thump or hiss commonly depicted in films and TV shows. Of what use, then, are suppressors? While suppressors can't fully silence firearms, they can still significantly reduce their noise profile, making gunshots less recognizable and, as such, harder to locate by enemy forces. By trapping, cooling, and diffusing the propellant gases that emerge from the barrel, suppressors can also eliminate muzzle flash and reduce felt recoil by up to 30%, making a firearm even stealthier and easy to handle. Finally, in a civilian context, suppressors can allow firearms to be used in enclosed spaces without deafening the user or bystanders, reducing or eliminating the need to wear hearing protection while shooting, and limit the distance over which gunshots can be heard. Indeed, in many European countries, including the UK and Finland, civilian hunters and target shooters are encouraged to use suppressors in order to reduce noise pollution. Strangely, mainstream acceptance of suppressors has not carried over across the pond, despite the significantly laxer gun laws in North America compared to Europe. This is largely due to the popular perception of suppressors being the tool of assassins, criminals, and other nefarious characters, a perception reinforced by countless books, films, and TV shows. Suppressors are prohibited outright in 9 US states and in Canada, and are obtainable everywhere else only via a complicated and expensive application process through the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. Since 2011, the National Rifle Association and the National Suppressor Association have run concerted campaigns aimed at debunking common myths regarding suppressors and promoting their use for reducing noise pollution around outdoor ranges and hearing loss among sport shooters and bystanders. So far, however, these campaigns have done little to change the ATF's stance on the issue. While the best modern suppressors are only capable of lowering the sound of a gunshot to just below the 140 decibel threshold for immediate hearing loss, a handful of historical firearms have come very close to attaining Hollywood quiet levels of suppression. The most famous example is the previously mentioned Dalal carbine, an integrally suppressed 45 caliber bolt-action rifle used by British commandos during the Second World War. In official testing, the sound of a Dalal firing registered at 85.5 decibels, while the Welrod, an integrally suppressed 32 caliber pistol developed for British Special Operations Executive or SOE, registered as low as 73 decibels. However, 1940s sound measuring equipment was not as sophisticated as today, and modern testing has pegged these numbers as closer to 110 and 122 decibels respectively. Similarly, the suppressed version of the Sten submachine gun, also used by British commandos, registers at around 127 decibels. While these noise levels are, according to OSHA, equivalent to a loud nightclub or construction site, in practice these weapons were almost unrecognizable at even close ranges. For example, another ultra-quiet firearm from the period was the High Standard HDM, a 22 caliber integrally suppressed pistol developed for the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, the precursor to the CIA. The effectiveness of this weapon was dramatically demonstrated by OSS head William Donovan during a meeting with US President Franklin Roosevelt at the White House. While White House was busy dictating a letter, Donovan turned his back and emptied an HDM pistol into a sandbag. He then turned around and announced to the astonished president that he was finished with his demonstration. Despite the pistol registering at 120 decibels, Roosevelt reportedly hadn't realized that a firearm was being discharged. The quietest firearms on record, however, are the MSP, SP4M, OTS-38, and PSS pistols developed by the Soviet Union and later the Russian Federation for use by KGB and FSB operatives. Instead of being suppressed themselves, these weapons are designed to use specially integrated silenced ammunition, specifically the 7.62 by 42mm SP4 cartridge. This cartridge features a sliding piston ahead of the propellant powder charge, which upon firing is propelled forward and strikes the base of the bullet, pushing it down the barrel. The piston then stops and seals off the end of the cartridge, preventing propellant gas from escaping and completely eliminating noise, muzzle flash, and smoke. In official testing, these pistols registered at only 110 decibels, with nearly all this noise coming from the firing mechanism. This stealth, however, comes at the cost of muzzle velocity, with the Russian silenced pistols having an effective range of only 25 meters. A similar weapon, called the Quiet Special Purpose Revolver, or QSPR, was developed by the US Army for use in Viet Cong tunnels during the Vietnam War, while the captive piston suppression concept has even been applied to artillery in the form of the Belgian Fly-K spigot mortar. Unlike in conventional mortars, where the bomb is dropped down and fired from a tubular barrel, the Fly-K bomb features a hollow tail boom containing a propellant charge and a captive piston, which slides over a cylindrical launch rod or spigot. As in the SP4 cartridge, upon firing, the piston is propelled down the length of the tail boom, launching the bomb off the spigot. It then halts at the end of its travel, sealing off the boom and eliminating all noise and flash. Yet despite their numerous advantages, outside of special operations applications, suppressors have not been widely adopted by regular military forces. At first glance, this might seem strange, for what army wouldn't want its troops to be stealthier? However, there is a sound psychological reason for militaries eschewing suppressors: the doctrine of suppressing fire. On the battlefield, small arms fire is often used not to directly engage the enemy, but rather to keep their heads down so friendly forces can safely advance. In these situations, the louder the gunshot, the better. Suppressed firearms simply don't possess the same intimidation factor. In conclusion, suppressors are not the magical, uber-sneaky devices Hollywood would have us believe, capable of muffling gunshots to the level of a whisper. Nevertheless, they do have a wide range of applications, from disguising the nature and origin of gunshots to reducing hearing loss and noise pollution. Thus, in spite of their less than savory reputation, suppressors remain a useful part of any civilian or military shooter's toolkit. And before you ask, no, neither an empty pop bottle or a pillow will work as an effective improvised suppressor. That too is pure Hollywood. And if you were caught trying to improvise a suppressor without a permit, you will likely find yourself being told that you have the right to remain silent.
Hollywood spies often have a myriad of amazing devices at their disposal for getting rid of bad guys in clandestine ways. It turns out occasionally, so do real spies. Exhibit A, the CIA's undetectable poison dart gun that near silently shot frozen darts comprised of an unspecified and undetectable poison. The individual hit would reportedly at most feel something like a mosquito bite as the dart penetrated their skin. It would then quickly melt and the poison would do its work, leaving the victim dead of an apparent heart attack with no detectable evidence of the poison remaining. The weapon was revealed as part of a broader Senate investigation into intelligence and covert action abuses by the agency. The disclosure of the full gamut of activities and devices caused Senator Frank Church to conclude that the CIA had become a rogue elephant rampaging out of control. Spurred by the publication of Seymour Hersh's game-changing article in the New York Times on December 22, 1974, which relayed assassination attempts and covert activities to subvert both foreign governments as well as American anti-war and other dissidents, the Senate formed the Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities in 1975. Chaired by Senator Church during its 2 years of hearings, the Church Committee, as it came to be known, published 14 reports on a variety of abuses by the CIA, Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, the National Security Agency, NSA, as well as others. These included routinely opening and resealing U.S. citizens' mail since 1952, misusing tax information to target domestic dissidents, and conducting domestic electronic surveillance of peace and Black Power activists. In addition, for the CIA, this also included developing weapons such as, to quote, a pistol that can fire a poison dart 328 feet, kill a man before he knows he has been hit, and leave no clue as to what killed him. Part of a program named MK Naomi, established for conducting and managing bacteriological warfare, the poison dart gun was just one of many experiments by the agency, which also included pesticides to ravage crops, and on one occasion using the NYC subway to test out a trial model of a biological warfare attack. On September 16, 1975, then CIA Director William Colby testified regarding the development of toxic agents at a laboratory at Fort Detrick. Notably, Director Colby testified that only limited records remained of these activities, even though the program spanned from 1952 to 1970. Among the director's many extraordinary statements were these from his prepared remarks. The specific subject today concerns CIA's involvement in the development of bacteriological warfare materials, retention of an amount of shellfish toxin, and CIA's use and investigation of various chemicals and drugs. The need for such capabilities was tied to the development of 2 different types of suicide pills to be used in the event of capture during World War II, and a successful operation using biological warfare materials to incapacitate a Nazi leader temporarily. A memo of 1967 identified the range of project activity: maintenance of a stockpile of temporarily incapacitating and lethal agents, assessment and maintenance of biological and chemical dissemination systems, and adaptation and testing of a dart device for clandestine and imperceptible inoculation with biological warfare or chemical warfare agents. The only application of this shellfish toxin was in the U-2 flight over the USSR in May 1960, Gary Powers' flight. Various dissemination devices, such as a fountain pen dart launcher and an engine head bolt designed to release a substance when heated, were developed. Success was never achieved for the temporarily incapacitating dart system, since a larger amount of an incapacitating agent is required to safely inactivate a human than of a lethal agent to kill him. Upon further questioning by the senators, Colby described how the poison dart gun worked. The chairman: does this pistol fire the dart? Mr. Colby: yes, the round thing at the top is obviously the sight, the rest of it is practically a normal 45. However, it works by electricity. There is a battery in the handle. The chairman: so that it fires silently? Mr. Colby: almost silently. The The chairman. And the dart itself, when it strikes the target, does the target know? Mr. Colby. That depends. There are different kinds of these flechettes, darts, and a special one was developed which potentially would enter the target without perception. The chairman. Is it not true that the effort not only involved designing a gun, but also the toxin itself would not appear in the autopsy? Mr. Colby. Yes, so there was no way of perceiving that the target was hit. Senator Tower. Turning to the dart gun, was it ever employed for any purpose by the agency? Mr. Colby. I think merely experiments. I do not know of any actual use. There is no record of any actual use. Given that their main and really own purpose is violently exploding, you might be surprised to learn that most explosives utilized by the military are shockingly stable. In fact, C4 won't even explode if you set it on fire and then you shoot it. Indeed, beyond the benefit of being able to shape the explosive in a variety of ways to accomplish a given destructive goal, one of the main reasons plastic explosives like C4 are utilized so extensively by the military is precisely because they are largely inert and can be handled without specialized equipment. Further, creating C4 is noted as being a relatively simple process that involves mixing a plasticizer with a conventional explosive. In this case, usually cyclotrimethylene trinitramine, often referred to as RDX or Royal Demolition Explosive, or for the non-Brits, Research Department Explosive. While exact ratios vary somewhat, for reference, in its C4, the US military currently uses a mixture of 91% RDX, 5.3% of the plasticizer dioctyl sebacate, 2.1% of synthetic rubber, and 1.6% mineral oil, or for civilian use, motor oil, giving such C4 its telltale odor of, well, motor oil. Commonly likened to ordinary modeling clay in texture and consistency, C4 and most other plastic explosives can be shaped, stored, and molded just as easily. The key difference is that, unlike modeling clay, a mere ½ kilogram of C4 can turn a typical vehicle into a pile of scrap metal. The key to making this happen, though, is attaching some form of blasting cap. As the name suggests, these blasting caps rely on a smaller and controlled explosion, which will in turn cause the explosive components within the C4 to go off, resulting in the C4 producing a wave of gases including nitrogen and carbon oxides that rapidly expand outwards at upwards of 18,000 miles per hour. So fast is this effect that it actually creates something of a temporary vacuum around the core blast area. This results in a second, much less violent wave of air collapsing in on the vacuum after the initial blast. Not keen to just rely on theory, the US Army has conducted countless sensitivity tests on C4 and other plastic explosive compounds, shooting them with bullets of varying calibers and even putting them within feet of things like hand grenades to see if that explosion or subsequent shrapnel could set the C4 off. The Army has even conducted tests to see if things like fire will cause C4 to explode, all with very little effect. In fact, it turns out C4 not only remains stable while on fire, but it actually burns quite slowly, making it a good fire starter if you don't mind the poisonous fumes. While you might think that soldiers would be scared to use the compound in this way, both because of an accidental explosion possibly happening or from the noxious gases that are given off, amazingly, during the Vietnam War, using several small chunks of C4 as tinder to light campfires or even as the sole source of the fire itself was indeed a thing that many soldiers did, despite military brass advising against it, owing to the poisonous gases that were given off. Further, beyond its use as an explosive, fire starter, and badass modeling clay, it turns out that when eaten in extremely small amounts, C4 is known to produce a mild high likened to being drunk, something soldiers in Vietnam also took advantage of. It's probably worth mentioning at this point that when consumed in anything other than extremely tiny quantities, C4 can cause a host of health problems, as noted in a case study published in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine in 2002, where a soldier decided to swallow about a cubic centimeter of the substance. Doing this can lead to things like generalized seizures, lethargy, coma, muscular twitching, hyperreflexia, myalgias, headaches, vomiting, mild renal injury, and hematuria, that's blood in your pee. Alright, so let's get back to the extreme stability of C4. As they often do, the show Mythbusters took the idea of testing this to its logical extreme. They shot a piece of C4 that was currently on fire with a high explosive incendiary round. The C4 stubbornly refused to explode even then, despite the incendiary round giving a nice little blast on impact. There is one caveat to all of this, however. It turns out there is a way to set off C4 by shooting at it. How? While there are a variety of designs for blasting caps, some may be set off by being hit with a bullet, thus providing the needed energy to cause the C4 itself to explode. Why this is an extremely unlikely scenario in the real world is because these blasting caps are typically very small. Think about half of a used pencil, and anyone trying to shoot at them would presumably want to be a fair distance away, just in case they were successful. This all becomes even less likely in real-world scenarios, given that you don't put the blasting cap in your C4 until you're preparing to make it go boom. So in the end, while there are certainly many unstable explosives that will happily release their destructive power if you were to shoot them, it turns out plastic explosives and pretty much the majority of explosives used by militaries and for industrial use the world over are almost always shockingly stable, precisely because these organizations aren't keen on deploying explosive devices that might go off unexpectedly. And let's get into that bonus fact. So speaking of shooting at explosive devices, during World War I there are documented instances of soldiers using shotguns to destroy thrown hand grenades before they could reach their target. For example, in Leroy Thompson's US Combat Shotguns book, he notes the following account where a group of soldiers acted in concert in this way. Their first warnings were German potato masher hand grenades lobbing through the air. Few landed, as most of them were exploded in the air by the experts in the outposts. Upon the failure of the grenade attack, the enemy launched a mortar attack. Again, the trap shooters proved their worth, deflecting the slowly arching bombs. Finally, a vast grey wave of the Kaiser's best surged forward. Considered to be little more than a historical curio today, the early 18th century puckle gun was nonetheless one of the most advanced firearms of its age, capable of firing one shot every 6 seconds in an era when even the most highly skilled soldier equipped with a musket typically topped out at a rate of about one shot every 20 seconds. Invented by one James Puckle Esquire, an English lawyer and essayist, the puckle gun was a flintlock weapon capable of turning a man's insides into a cloud of viscera. Its most unique feature was a rotating cylinder that allowed it to overcome the inherent issue that plagued all flintlock weapons of the era, a glacial rate of fire. More akin to a modern revolver, the gun is nonetheless often described inaccurately as the first machine gun. In fact, it was amongst the first, if not being the first gun to ever be called that, when, in a 1722 shipping manifest, it was noted that the ship had on board 2 machine guns of Puckles. Curiously modern-looking in its design, the puckle gun boasted a 3-foot-long barrel and was designed to sit atop a tripod. It could also swivel and be aimed in any direction extremely rapidly with little effort by the operator due to how well balanced it was. Once the prototype was completed in 1717, Puckle approached the British Navy, who at the time were having a lot of trouble with Ottoman pirates. You see, the large broadside cannons their ships were equipped with were a poor weapon of choice to use against tiny, fast-moving vessels that could quite literally run circles around the bigger craft. Puckle felt his gun was perfect for this use case. Ships could quite easily have several of the Puckle guns mounted all around the perimeter of the deck and fire at approaching pirates with incredible speed for the age. Intrigued, officials from the English Board of Ordnance were sent to observe a demonstration of the gun in 1717 in Woolwich. Unfortunately for Puckle, while they were reportedly impressed with the speed at which it could launch projectiles of death and how quickly it could be reloaded, they decided to pass. Their objections to it were primarily that it featured an unreliable flintlock system and it was too complex to be easily manufactured, including requiring many custom-made components that gunsmiths at that point didn't have. All of this combined to make it a difficult thing to mass produce. On top of that, it didn't exactly lend itself to a variety of tactical situations due to its size. Unperturbed at the initial rejection, Puckle continued to refine the design, patenting a better version of the gun a year later in 1718. Said patent number 418 describes the gun as being primarily for defensive purposes and notes that it is ideal for defending bridges, breaches, lines and passes, ships, boats, houses, and other places from pesky foreigners. A natural salesman, Puckle went as far as putting advertising of sorts right in his patent, with the second line of the patent reading, "Defending King George, your country and laws is defending yourselves and Protestant cause." This is an idea Puckle would double down on by including engravings on the gun itself featuring things like King George, imagery of Britain, and random Bible verses. To doubly sell potential investors on the value of the gun as a stalwart defender of Christian ideology, Puckle's patent also describes how the gun could, in a pinch, fire square bullets. Alright, so at this point you might be wondering, well, yes, Simon, well, what on earth does that have to do with religion? Puckle thought that square bullets would cause significantly more damage to the human body and believed that if they were shot at Muslim Turks, who the British were fighting at the time, it would, to quote the patent, convince them of the benefits of Christian civilization. The gun could also fire regular round projectiles too, which Puckle earmarked as being for use against Christians only. On top of that, it also fired Granados shots, essentially comprising of many tiny bullets, for when you really wanted to ruin someone's day. Puckle began selling shares of his company to the public in 1720 for about £8 a piece, which is about £1,100 or $1,600 today, in order to finance construction of more advanced Puckle guns, one of which was demonstrated to the public on March 31st, 1722. During said demonstration, as described in the London Journal, one man discharged it 63 times in 7 minutes, though all while raining, and it throws off either one large or 16 musket balls at every discharge with great force. Despite the impressive and reliable display, the British military on the whole was still uninterested in the newfangled technology. That said, there was at least one order placed by then Master General of Ordnance for Britain, Duke John Montagu. He ordered 2 guns to bring along in an attempt to capture St. Vincent and St. Lucia in the Caribbean. Whether these ever ended up being used or not is not clear. Whatever the case, the 2 Puckle guns in question are still around today and can presently be seen at Bourton House and Booley Palace, homes once owned by Montagu. As for Puckle, he died in 1724, never seeing his gun levelled against the enemies of King George, much to the relief of 18th century Turks everywhere. Summing up his failed invention and company, one sarcastic reporter for the London Journal quipped that the gun had only wounded those who have shares therein. Burn. And let's get into those bonus facts, shall we? If you happen to think that killing 2 birds with 1 stone is a teeny bit inefficient, you might want to look into the Punt gun, capable of killing upwards of 50 to 100 birds in a single shot. First put to use in the 1800s, the Punt guns were never manufactured on a large scale, with each being custom made by a gunsmith to fit a buyer's specifications. But in general, the barrel had openings upwards of 2 inches, that's 5 centimeters in diameter, and weighed over 100 pounds, that's 45 kilograms. They generally could fire more than a pound of shot at a time and usually measured over 10 feet, that's 3 meters long. As you might imagine from this, they were too heavy and the recoil was too strong for a hunter to fire them by hand. Instead, they were usually mounted to small, often flat-bottomed boats known as punts. Hunters aimed the gun by maneuvering the boat into position 1 or 2 dozen meters from their targets, and then they would fire. As an example of how effective this was, a market hunter in the eastern United States, Ray Todd, claimed he and 3 other hunters with punt guns managed to kill 419 ducks in one night in a single volley after encountering a huge flock over a half-mile long and nearly as wide. After the first volley, he stated, "The birds flew off a short distance and began to feed again. We made 3 more shots that night. By morning, we had killed over 1,000 ducks. They brought $3.50 a pair in Baltimore, and it was the best night's work we had ever done." Not surprisingly, in the years after market hunters began using the punt guns, the population of wild waterfowl began to decline in the United States dramatically. Sportsmen who hunted for personal use of the killed waterfowl rather than for profit like the market hunters began advocating for hunting regulations and limits. In response, many states in the US outlawed the use of punt guns by the 1860s, while the Lacey Act of 1900 and the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918 effectively ended their use in the country. That said, punt guns are still legal in the United Kingdom, though their barrels are restricted to a diameter less than 1.75 inches. Hunters must also have a permit from the government for the gun and black powder, and they must adhere to strict hunting seasons. All this hasn't proved much of a problem, as there are only a few dozen currently used punt guns left in the UK today.
If you happen to think killing 2 birds with 1 stone is a bit inefficient, or you found your way into a zombie apocalypse, you might be interested in a special type of gun known as a punt gun. This is actually a gun that used to be somewhat common among commercial waterfowl hunters. So, what's so special about this gun? Well, it's capable of killing upwards of 50 to 100 birds in a single shot. Market hunters first made their appearance in what would become the United States around the time of the Pilgrims and continued plying their trade en masse until around the beginning of the 20th century. Some earned their living by bringing as many ducks or other waterfowl to market as possible. While various methods were used for bringing down the maximum number of birds per hunting trip, the most effective was ambushing a large flock with a punt gun. First put into use in the 1800s, the first punt guns were never manufactured on a large scale, with each being custom made by a gunsmith to fit a buyer's specifications. But in general, the barrels had openings upwards of 2 inches, that's 5 centimeters in diameter, and weighed over 100 pounds, that's 45 kilograms. They generally could fire more than a pound of shot at a time and usually measured over 10 feet, that's 3 meters long. As you might imagine from this, they were too heavy and the recoil too strong for a hunter to fire them by hand. Instead, they were usually mounted to small, often flat-bottomed boats known as punts. Hunters aimed the gun by maneuvering the boat into a position 1 or 2 dozen meters from their targets, and then they fired. That said, not all punt guns were always mounted to boats. One of the smallest examples of a punt gun is known as Herforth's cannon. Created by German gunsmith August Herforth in Wisconsin, it measures 63 inches, that's 160 centimeters long, and includes a 46-inch, that's 116 centimeter long Remington octagonal barrel with a 1-inch diameter. As for the weight, it's approximately 26 pounds or just under 12 kilograms, making it a featherweight compared to most punt guns. However, it is still much too big and has too much kick to be fired like a normal shotgun. However, its smaller size did allow the hunter to hunt from the shore if it was properly braced against something. On the other end of the spectrum, the world's largest punt gun was Irish Tom. This was reported to have taken down a little over 100 birds with a single shot, according to its original owner. However, a more usual haul per shot was in a range of about 50 birds, give or take a dozen or 2. Irish Tom's barrel measures more than 14 feet long, that's 4.2 meters, and the whole gun weighs more than 300 pounds, that's 136 kilograms. More akin to a cannon than a shotgun, it could fire over 3 pounds of shot with the help of about 10 ounces of black powder. The size of Irish Tom meant its first owner was forced to build a specially reinforced punt boat which was 24 feet long. Market hunters used punt guns from the 19th through the early 20th century. The hunters often worked in groups of 8 to 10 and fired their combined punt guns at the same time to maximize the number of waterfowl that they could hit. As an example of how effective this was, a market hunter in the eastern United States, Ray Todd, claimed he and 3 other hunters with punt guns managed to kill 419 ducks over one night in a single volley after encountering a huge flock over half a mile long and nearly as wide. After the first volley, he stated, "The birds flew off a short distance and began to feed again. We made 3 more shots that night. By morning, we had killed over 1,000 ducks. They brought $3.50 a pair in Baltimore, and it was the best night's work we had ever done." Not surprisingly, in the years after market hunters began using punt guns, the population of wild waterfowl began to decline in the United States rather dramatically. Punt guns most certainly played a role in the decline, along with the decrease in available habitat. Sportsmen who hunted for personal use of the killed waterfowl rather than for profit like the market hunters began advocating for hunting regulations and limits. In response, many states in the US outlawed the use of punt guns in the 1860s, while the Lacey Act of 1900 and the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918 effectively ended their use in the country. That said, punt guns are still legal in the United Kingdom, though their barrels are restricted to a diameter less than 1.75 inches. Hunters must also have a permit from the government for the gun and the black powder, and they must adhere to strict hunting seasons. All this hasn't proved much of a problem, as there are only a few dozen currently used punt guns left in the UK today.
Initially designed and produced during World War II for British soldiers, the Sten was developed as a direct response to both dwindling supplies of American-made Thompson machine guns and the evacuation of Dunkirk, during which the British abandoned many thousands of guns. In efforts to rearm its troops as quickly as possible for the defence of the homeland, the British government requested that the Royal Small Arms Factory in Enfield design an alternative to the increasingly hard-to-obtain Thompson. So there's this old maxim which states
it, well, you can have it fast, you can have it good, or cheap. Pick two. Given the title of this video, you can probably guess which two of these were emphasized by the British government. The original design for the Sten is chiefly credited to two men, Major R.V. Shepherd and Harold Turpin, who finalized the design in the closing months of 1940. The first Sten prototype, it was reportedly of reasonably high quality for what it was. It featured a flash hider, a foregrip, as well as having wooden finishing that gave the gun a rather sleek appearance. So about 100,000 of these were produced in the summer of 1941 before the government decided to strip the already Spartan Sten down in order to save money, materials, and reduce the build time even further. Well, the result, that would be the rather creatively named Sten Mark II. Just a few months after it entered production, the Mark II became both the bane and the boon of many an Allied soldier's life. On the one hand, the Sten Mark II could be produced for less than $10, which is about $160 today, and in about 5 man-hours. In contrast, by the way, the Thompson cost $140, which is about $2,300 today to produce. Not only that, but the Sten used only 2 machined parts, the barrel and the bolt, with the rest being made, as a 1943 edition of Popular Science put it, from the cheapest kind of stamping. Initially, the design even used common bed springs as a main component. With the help of assembly lines, all total, an estimated 2 million Sten Mark IIs were produced during the war, and approximately 4 million total in the Sten line of guns. Due to its simplistic design, the Sten Mark II was remarkably easy to maintain and required virtually no lubrication to function properly. In fact, the construction was so simple that resistance fighters who couldn't get their hands on the genuine article even sometimes simply just made their own. Another great benefit of the Sten's jury-rigged design was that it could be easily customized to accept magazines from other guns. Indeed, you could also just whack a different type of silencer or even a different viewing sight on the thing. The ammunition for the gun was also very easy to come by, given that the Mark II was significantly designed to use the 9mm German parabellum bullets, which were the most commonly used round by various European militaries. Needless to say, they were readily available to resistance fighters in Nazi-occupied territories, particularly as the Germans started to retreat. The Mark II was also literally murder in close combat, able to fire off rounds at a rate of 500 to 550 per minute, although its clip only held 32 rounds. It was also relatively accurate up to 100 meters if one held a firm grip and used short bursts. It was also light and it was easy to conceal. Essentially, the weapon was ideal for taking out many enemy soldiers at close range, and if you surprised them, perhaps even before they'd have a chance to raise their weapons. Alright, well, all of this sounds pretty amazing so far, so what exactly was the problem with this gun? Well, if you, say, bumped the gun hard enough, or just dropped it, or even just set it down a bit too firmly, it had a tendency to fire on its own. What's worse is that it would sometimes do that in fully automatic mode. Indeed, it would unload the entire clip in a moment of self-firing frenzy. Beyond the main gun firing when soldiers didn't want it to, it was also ridiculously prone to not firing when they did want it to. This was due to an inherent flaw in the magazine's feed design, which was intentionally based on the magazines used by the German MP38. The reason they modeled it off this German gun was so that it would have various compatibilities. The problem with this design was that it used a double-column single-feed mechanism, meaning 2 columns of bullets would have to merge into one for firing, requiring an extremely precise feed angle in order to work. This is in contrast to the double-column double-feed design in the much more reliable Thompson. The former is still fine if the parts are well manufactured and sturdy, but the Sten parts were pretty much anything but that, particularly in the early going when the British were desperate to churn out as many of the guns as possible and had little in the way of quality control. For this reason, Canadian-produced Mark IIs were noted as being much more reliable than their British equivalents. Indeed, the jamming problem was so bad that it was common for soldiers to extensively test-fire each of the Stens that they were issued before trying to use them in combat. Units that were determined to be more prone to jamming than others were simply tossed aside. But even if you had a Mark II that seemed to perform well at first, small amounts of dirt or other debris could cause the guns to jam, which was a particular problem in the muddy conditions prevalent across the European front. This problem was greatly exacerbated by the fact that the long opening that the cocking knob ran along readily allowed for such debris to enter the gun. So the most notable example of a Sten Mark II jamming at an inopportune time was in the assassination attempt of SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich. This occurred during Operation Anthropoid on May 27, 1942. The assassins waited along Heydrich's normal daily commute, which would necessarily pass a certain bend where they knew the car would have to slow to a near stop. In a move that later resulted in Hitler calling Heydrich an idiot, Heydrich chose to drive his daily commute in an open-top Mercedes rather than in an armored car. As such, when the exposed car reached the bend in the road, one of the would-be assassins, Joseph Gabchik, pointed his Sten Mark II at Heydrich at near point-blank range. He pulled the trigger, and the Sten gun did what it was wont to do, and that would be jam. Luckily for the assassins, rather than telling him to speed off, Heydrich told his driver to stop so he could go after the attackers. While Heydrich did eventually manage a rousing chase, when the car stopped, one of the other assassins, Jan Kubisch, chucked a modified anti-tank mine at it. The resulting explosion and shrapnel severely injured Heydrich's spleen, left lung, diaphragm, and also fractured a rib. Nevertheless, bleeding profusely, he still chased his attackers for a time before becoming too weak from his injuries. Later, surgery was partially successful in that he survived at first and that his wounds began to heal, but a few days later, he succumbed to infection and died. Despite its many problems, the Sten Mark II played a significant role in the Allies' early efforts in World War II, managing to put an exceptionally deadly close-range weapon in the hands of Allied fighters instead of the hunting and bolt-action rifles left over from World War I, which were all that some soldiers had to use before the Mark II. That said, the Sten's importance didn't stop soldiers from giving it colourful nicknames like the Stench Gun, the Plumber's Nightmare, and the Woolworth's Wonder. The latter name there, the Woolworth's Wonder, is named after a British retail chain which is known for selling cheap toys and gifts.
In the 1950s, US forces were stretched dangerously thin. US President Dwight D. Eisenhower stated of this, "My feeling remains that it would be impossible for the United States to maintain the military commitments which it now sustains around the world without turning into a garrison state did we not possess atomic weapons and the will to use them when necessary." No surprise from that. Unsatisfied with the portability of their shiny new M65 nuclear cannons, which required a couple of very large trucks to transport, and further unsatisfied that firing it off in many tactical situations would be a bit like killing a mosquito with a hand grenade, in the late 1950s, the US military brass for once were thinking a bit smaller. What they really wanted was a simple weapon that could launch a miniature nuclear warhead, could be carted around by a few soldiers, and could be fired relatively quickly and reliably. This would allow a handful of soldiers to successfully combat far superior forces on the other side, even at relatively close range, which none of the other nuclear weapons of the age could safely do. And this is where the Davy Crockett enters the picture. Rumor has it that the name was chosen in homage to the famed American politician, owing to the legend that he once grinned a bear to death, with the idea referencing the association between Russia and the Soviet Union in general with bears. Whether that's actually the reasoning behind the name or not, the first prototype of the Davy Crockett was completed in November of 1958 and ultimately deployed about 2.5 years later in May of 1961. Featuring a variant of the W-54 warhead contained in an M388 round, the projectile was fired from an M28 or M29 smooth-bore recoilless gun. This was capable of launching the 10 or 20-ton yield nuke as far as about 1.25 miles for the M28 or 2.5 miles for the M29. As for portability, the Davy Crockett could either be deployed and fired from the back of a Jeep for maximum mobility, or even broken down into its components, with the pieces of the weapon being carried by 5 soldiers on foot. The general procedure for firing the 76-pound nuclear rounds was quite simple. First, a spotting round would be shot from an attached gun to ensure the weapon was aimed reasonably well. After this, in order to get the nuke to end up more or less where the spotting round did, the angle of the gun would have to be adjusted. To do this, a small book with pre-calculated tables was carried, giving adjustment figures for said angle. However, it turns out test firings with non-live nukes showed again and again that the Davy Crockett was an obscenely inaccurate weapon, possibly both because of the angle adjustments and that the weapon itself was smooth bore. Of course, the fact that the Davy Crockett was shooting a nuclear warhead helped make this inaccuracy issue not as much of a problem as would be the case with other similar weapons. Once the target was mildly locked on, the propellant charge would be inserted into the muzzle with a metal piston placed in after as a sort of cap. This was followed by the M388 round itself containing the M54 warhead. As the M388 was far too big to fit inside of the bore, instead a rod would be attached to the back with the nuke sitting at the front. As for how the warhead would know when to detonate, there was a timer dial that would be set based on estimated distance to the target. This was calculated using figures given in the aforementioned book containing a spreadsheet of tables. However, contrary to what is often stated, the timer was not actually the thing that triggered the detonation. Rather, it simply armed the bomb once the time ran out. The actual trigger for detonation was a simple radar device in the back of the M388 that would detect how far above ground the nuke was. There was also a high and low switch that could slightly adjust height of detonation based on the radar reading. As you might have gleaned from all of this, and also contrary to what is often stated, the switch did not control the yield of the bomb, just at what height it would detonate above the ground, which was roughly 20 to 50 feet AGL, depending on the setting. It should be noted that unlike many other nuclear weapons, this was an otherwise dumb nuke. Once the timer was set and it was fired, it would either go off or would prove itself to be a dud. There was no aborting a detonation after launch. If all that is involved in firing the Davy Crockett sounds like it might take a long time, it turns out that's not at all the case given the destructive power of the weapon. One former Davy Crockett section soldier, Thomas Herman, notes that they were actually trained and very capable of firing a nuke every 2.5 minutes. Alright, so now let's answer the question that's probably in your minds, and that's, well, just how deadly could this weapon be? While extremely low powered as nukes go, the weapon nonetheless produced a blast in the ballpark of as large as the highest yield non-nuclear explosive devices of the era. But unlike many of these, it was relatively small and portable. More important than this was its potential for extended damage long after the initial blast. This was particularly useful when fired around critical routes that enemy soldiers would have to traverse. Not only would the initial blast do significant damage to any soldiers and enemy vehicles around at the time, but the radioactive fallout, which would almost certainly be fatal to anyone within about a quarter of a mile of the initial blast when it went off, would remain for long after, making a given route, such as a mountain pass, impassable for several days after a detonation. Naturally, the Soviets could defend against this simply by equipping each of their soldiers with lead-lined refrigerators, but for whatever reason, they never seem to have chosen to go for this route. On the other end of things, neither did the Americans. This was despite the fact that the Davy Crockett was also not terribly safe for those who were firing it. While 1.25 to 2.5 miles away is plenty of range to keep the soldiers who pulled the trigger safe from being harmed by the blast itself, in real-world scenarios, the enemy being fired upon could be closer, and some of your own troops, they might be closer still. Critical to all of this was also wind direction. With no winds, the radiation kill zone in the immediate aftermath of the blast was approximately 1,500 feet, but winds could easily blow dangerous radioactive particles towards one's own troops. As such, crew were instructed to, if possible, only fire the gun when suitable cover behind a hill or the like was available in order to help reduce radiation exposure. That said, presumably to try and get the soldiers operating the weapon to be slightly less hesitant about firing it, the instruction manual notes that the leader of the troop should instill a great sense of urgency in the soldiers operating the Davy Crockett, and to remember that, to quote, "the search for nuclear targets is constant and vigorous." The manual further states that if the nuke doesn't go off, the soldier should wait half an hour and then go and recover the supposedly armed nuclear bomb. Needless to say, while the Davy Crockett was deployed everywhere from West Germany to South Korea, with well over 2,000 of the M388 rounds made and 100 of the guns deployed, it was never actually used in battle. That said, the Army did do one test fire of the Davy Crockett with a live M388 round. This occurred during Operation Sunbeam in a test code named Little Fella 1, which took place on July 17, 1962. The nuke flew approximately 1.7 miles and detonated successfully about 130 feet above the ground, with an estimated yield of 18 tons from the blast. Interestingly enough, this was the last time the United States would detonate a nuke in the air close to the ground, thanks to the 1963 treaty banning nuclear weapon tests in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. In the end, as cool as having a portable nuclear gun is and all, within only a few years the weapon would become antiquated, and by 1967 the army was already beginning to phase it out, with it going the way of the Dodo completely by 1971. This was no doubt to the eternal relief of the soldiers tasked with firing the thing should the need arise.
World War II saw the nations of the world investing massive amounts of manpower and money into the development of better ways to extinguish life in the hopes of turning the tide of the war in their respective favors. Sometimes including coming up with outlandish contraptions like surprisingly effective bat bombs and pigeon-guided missiles, as well as anti-tank dogs, flying jeeps and tanks, suicide torpedoes, super ships made of ice, and even balloon bombs randomly sent out with the hope they might land somewhere thousands of miles away on enemy soil. Today we'll be looking at another notable World War II weapon, the V3 cannon, a piece of artillery capable of hitting a target more than 100 miles away, shooting its projectiles around 3,400 miles per hour, that's 5,500 kilometers an hour. Technically, this is defined as a supergun, a term given to guns of such comically large size that they need to be categorized separately. The V3 was 430 feet long, 131 meters. This massive size meant that the gun had to be built already aiming at its target and could only reliably hit a target the size of a city, a fairly minor trade-off considering the weapon's nigh unparalleled range for a non-rocket-based weapon. The V3 was able to achieve the incredible projectile range due to a rather unique firing mechanism that utilized multiple smaller explosions rather than one big one along the length of its barrel that was set to go off just as the projectile passed these side chambers. This allowed the supergun to fire its payload at extreme distances without damaging the barrel, which had proved to be a problem for other similarly massive guns. Notable here, for reasons we'll get to in a minute, is the so-called Kaiser Wilhelm Geschütz, quite literally Emperor Wilhelm gun. This was a 200-ton, 111-foot gun that was used by the Germans to shell Paris during World War I. It could only fire around 60 rounds before its entire barrel needed to be replaced due to damage from the explosions used to launch its 106-kilo or 236-pound shells. The projectiles also had to be numbered and fired in a specific order, with each one slightly bigger than the previous one to account for the increasing diameter of the barrel as the massive cannon was fired each time. The Emperor gun was so powerful it was noted for being the first man-made invention to launch an object into the stratosphere, with the shells it launched peaking at an altitude of around 40 kilometers during flight. The range of the gun was so unthinkably extreme for such a weapon that the 80-man team in charge of firing it had to aim a little under a kilometer to the left of the target to account for the Coriolis effect. The French military genuinely suspected for a time that these projectiles were being launched from super-high zeppelins hiding behind clouds because the idea of them being fired from a gun up to 75 miles, 120 kilometers away, was deemed to be far too absurd. Virtually all records of this gun's existence and how it was constructed were destroyed towards the close of World War I. Nonetheless, it was known to the French, and in response they drafted plans for an even bigger gun that utilized multiple explosions to launch projectiles a similar distance. Sounding familiar? Well, these plans were ultimately archived by the French after World War I and were found by German soldiers in 1940, who then passed them on to August Conders, the guy who designed the V3 cannon. In other words, the only reason the V3 cannon was even invented is because the Germans found plans at the start of World War II explicitly drafted to counter another giant gun they'd used during World War I. In any event, beyond its massive range, a battery of V3 cannons could fire close to 300 shells an hour, or roughly one every 12 seconds. This is a fact that piqued the interest of Hitler himself, who enthusiastically granted the project near unlimited support when existence of a prototype was brought to his attention in 1943 by his advisor Albert Speer, even though said prototype had yet to fire a single shell. With Hitler throwing everything the German military had at its disposal behind the project in mid-1943, the V3 cannon, dubbed the high-pressure pump during construction to hide its purpose from spies, went from from the idea phase to construction almost immediately. Since Hitler wanted to use the gun to shell London, and the gun had to be built aiming at its target, the location had to be somewhere in northern France. The gun also needed to be built within close proximity to a railway due to the size of its ammunition, which could only be transported effectively via rail. Luckily for the Nazis, an ideal location was found in the form of a limestone hill located in a French hamlet in northern France. The location was deemed ideal as the chalk that made up most of the hill would be easy to excavate, but was ultimately strong enough to tunnel through to create the underground infrastructure needed for the weapon. Construction of 50 V3 guns began in earnest in September of 1943, utilizing a combination of drafted German engineers and Soviet POWs. The initial plan was for two separate facilities to be constructed roughly a kilometer apart, each housing 25 V3 cannons built into drifts dug in the hillside. They also planned to build tunnels connecting each facility that would be used for storing the shells, which in turn would be transported to the guns via an underground railway. Amazingly, construction of most of the underground tunnels was completed. However, construction of the guns themselves was severely hampered when the Allies learned of a German plan to attack London using an unknown superweapon in the later stages of 1943. Knowing that the Germans were planning something in the hamlet and putting two and two together, the RAF doggedly attacked it throughout the last few months of 1943 and during the first half of 1944. This led to the proposed number of V3 cannons dropping from 50 to 25 when the RAF destroyed the most western site. This was further reduced to 5 following a bombing run utilizing tallboy bombs specifically designed to destroy fortified bunkers on July 6, 1944. Plans were dropped altogether on July 30th of that same year due to the advance of Allied ground troops. The Allies wouldn't actually learn about the existence of the V3 cannons until after the war, at which point then Prime Minister Winston Churchill was reported as saying that the site could have been responsible for the most devastating attack of all on London. Although the Nazis never got a full-size V3 cannon working during World War II, they did manage to construct two smaller versions of the weapon with which they shelled the recently liberated Luxembourg from a somewhat less impressive distance of 43 kilometers or 26 miles away in late 1944. Smaller but still impressively powered, these mini V3s were capable of shooting off their deadly projectiles at speeds of over 2,000 miles per hour or 3,300 kilometers an hour. Despite the impressive specs and with the guns firing hundreds of rounds, 142 of which hit Luxembourg, only 10 people were killed and 35 were wounded as a result. While the Nazis tried desperately to use the gun again, even deploying one during their last major offensive of World War II, Operation Nordwind, they never actually successfully fired another version of the V3 again during the entire war, giving these guns a laughably low kill rate given the resources that were put into them. Today, the failed location of the French battery has been converted into a museum containing what remains of the guns.